Today's daf is daf Ches. So we learned yesterday. So we're learning here the three categories. You have the Bezdin, you have the Kohen Gadol, the Mashiach, then you have the Nasi, which is the king, and then you have the average person, the Yachid. And we are learning that a Kohen Gadol has very similar dinim to a Bezdin in the sense that he never brings a korban chatas for a sin unless he ruled for himself incorrectly, and then he followed and went according to what he said. So we are up to the Gemara here, Daf Tes Amud Aleph on the top of the page. The last thing we learned was an argument between Rebbe and Chachamim when it comes to Avodah Zarah. What happens with Kohen Gadol by Avodah Zarah? Do we say that he also has to paskin before he made a paskin incorrectly and then acted on it, or do we say that avodah zarah is only is no different than a yachid, which is Rebbe's opinion? But avodah zarah, kohen gadol, if he just behaves incorrectly, makes a mistake, he's already chayiv. Says the Gemara, the the very top of the page. So even though we had an argument of the Chachamim between Chachamim and Rebbe, nevertheless, we said, first of all, they all agree that the korban you bring is different than normally a Kohen Gadol brings a bull, but in the case of Avodah Zarah, he brings a female goat. But also, they all agree that he does not bring an Asham Toli, that a Kohen Gadol does not bring an Asham Toli. So the Gemara Vishavin, everyone beside Rebbe inside the Rabban agree. Shay maybe Asham Toli. Minolan, how do you know that you don't bring an Asham Toli? And we already said before. We learn now from the pasuk Shagogosoi Asher Shogag, says twice the word Shagig. So therefore, we learn out from there that only those who bring an Asham Toli, only those that they do a Shagig and they bring a karma straight away. A Kohen Gadol does not bring a karma straight away. He first has to rule that it was mutter before he brings his karma. So Vishavim, but everyone agrees that a Kohen Gadol maybe Asham Toli, very top of the page we left off yesterday. That you don't bring Asham Toli. How do you know that? The Chsiv, it says the Chip by regarding a Kohen Gadol, it says the Chipper all about Kohen Gadol that the Kohen that it should atone, that this should atone for the Kohen Ashugagos Shogag, the Shagid that he made. Rebbe holds that kol misha kol, it says shogag shogag misha kol chete b'shgoga. Only those people, when it comes to an asham tali, only those people that all the kabbanas they bring is a korban chata just for doing the wrong thing. Yotzeh kohen gadol, that most cases first he has to paskin that it's mutter before he brings the korban. Not all cases, because by avodah zarah Rebbe holds that the kohen gadol as soon as he makes if he made a very mistake he's already chayav a korban chatas. But it means most of it. Misha kol chete b'shgoga. All the Vedas he does, he brings the korban chatas. Forget about paskin. Yotzeh a kohen gadol is an exception. She'ein kol chete b'shgoga. Most of the Vedas he does, he will not bring a korban chatas unless first he paskin that it's wrong. Says the Gemara, media kol. See, where does it say the word kol? It says in yes. Does that every single time in korban chatas says Rebbe yes. The imkain otherwise nichtav aus gogosoi. Why repetitive? Lomali asher shogag. Hakamasha to teach you ad the equal kol chetav gogo. The only people who bring an oshim totally is that every time they do an avera, that chayiv a korban chatas, the chayiv just for doing the avera, those are the ones who bring oshim totally. And by kohen gadol, most times yes, even though sometimes no. But since not in all times he brings the korban chatas, but most times he has to first paskin that is mutter. Therefore, he's not included in Asham Toli. Only by Avodah Zarah does he bring, according to Rebbe, does he bring a korban chatas if he did an aveda without even pasking. But not the rest of the mitzvahs. He has to have a helm dover which is maisa. But Rabbanan, Misha chatas b'shgoga. Rabbanan say no. You know how they teach? Someone who sinned b'shegig, someone who sins and he does a shegig, he brings a korban. Yotze Mashiach by a kohen gadol she'ein chete b'shgoga. He never brings a korban, because Abraham hold that even avodah zarah, he has to paskin, has to be like a tzibur, a hoy rebezin, and then he went ahead and based himself on his sack. So therefore he's not shaykh to mashali. But loy b'avodah chaven, not b'avodah zarah, v'lo shamitzah, the kohen gadol never brings a korban chatas on its own. El b'helm dover im shigas ma'aser. So it comes an interesting thing. A kohen gadol who's an amorit, or a kohen gadol who's not the mufla like we had yesterday, never brings the korban ever. Because he only brings when he passes, but his psak is not a psak because he's not a learned person. Anyway, Mishnah. Ain't Bezdin Chayavin Achiyah, but obviously in college, Bezdin is not Chayiv until they paskin on. It's only regarding which mitzvahs, the 36 mitzvahs which are have a carbon, which have chorus, and every mitzvah that has chorus has a chatas. Except 5 exceptions that there isn't. Like for example, carbon Pesach, a bris milah. There's no carbon chatas if you don't do it, even though there's chorus if you don't do carbon Pesach. There's 5 in total. The Chain HaMashiach, same thing applies to a Kohen Gadol, the Loi Ba'avodah Chavim, and the same thing Ba'avodah Zorah. Ad Sheyedu Al Dovash as Doina Kodesh you go Chatzah. Ba'avodah Zorah also, even though the Torah separates it, makes it altogether different. Nevertheless, it has to be those Avedas that a chorus and a carbon Chatzas. Now here it doesn't say V'chein. The same thing applies to a Kohen Gadol. So you might use that as a proof. The Mishnah doesn't have to spell it out. He understands that we're comparing it. And same thing with yesterday. Says the Gemara B'Nolan, how do you know that has to be something which is chorus? And a karma chatzas that is holding a bezin making a mistake. That's the only time that they bring a par. The Tanya be learned. The Rebbe says, Never can it says of it the pasuk Allah. It says it that they realized they made a mistake. Ashachatu Allah, they made a mistake. It talks about it, the bezin forgot. And V'Nemal Hal, it says that by Horayos. It says that the word Allah. It says a woman and her sister you shouldn't marry. Why? Legalis ervosa Allah b'chaya. While the sister's alive, you don't marry his sister because he's being megala her erva. Oleha. So we make this gzera shavah. Malahal, who's about Arroyas? What's the sin over there? What's the punishment? You bring a chorus. Malahal dovish the chorus, and if you did it b'shay, you didn't realize it's wrong. Chatas is avkan. So too here when we say that a bezman forgets and the whole thing you bring of this par is dovish the chorus go chatas. So we know tzibur b'shir no the same applies to a kohen gadol, and we'll use this pasuk constantly because it says there by a kohen gadol that it says that when did he sin? It says he sinned la'ashma sa'am, the guilt of the nation. So again, we use that pasuk that's central to the whole thing, that we compare a kohen gadol to a bezin, the whole nation. Hadi Mashiach tzibur nasi. What about a king? A Nasi is a king, as we'll see more later. Nasi, how do you know a Nasi? The same thing. Yal, if you learn out, mitzvahs. Another good Shabbat. We learn mitzvahs. See, by Nasi, it says in the pasuk, if a Nasi sins, and the osa achaz mekol mitzvah Hashem, asher loyse asan. If he did one of the mitzvahs, he shouldn't have done. So it says the word was going to make Hashem. See, by Tzibur, it says the same thing. It says that if they all made a mistake and the Eini HaKol didn't realize what they're doing, and also Hashem, exact same words. So we compare a Nasi to a Tzibur. Same thing. Yochid. What about an individual? How do you know that individual does not bring a karma chatas only on those averis that if you did it b'mezid you get karas? How do you know that? Maybe every aveir in the Torah you bring a karma chatas, because Amakra it says in the pasuk after it talks about if the community makes a mistake in the bezin mistake, it says v'im nefesh. Vav is attaching it to the four. What yil mitachtim elyon, that you're comparing it whatever all those cases we talked about previously with a bezdin Sanhedrin. Same thing applies to a yachid. And same thing about Avodah Zarah also. It's only if there's the chorus and the chatzis. Says the Gemara, since the Torah took separate Avodah Zarah, that's in Shlach, versus everything else written in Parashat Vayikra, all of the mitzvahs in Parashat Vayikra, how do you know that the same didn't apply? So the Gemara, how do you know? The Torah might be learned. Torah made a separate parsha on Avodah Zarah. I would have thought on our own that maybe it has different dinim. I feel davar she'ein on the kodesh. You go chatzis, even something which not that activity is not amazing. A chorus or a chatas, but we learn now that it is. Why? Nemakan. It says over here by Avodah Zarah. It says me'ene. It says if in me'ene eda they did it with shagig. But nema lahala, and before we had when it talks about other mitzvahs in Parsha Yikra, it says me'ena, right? V'nelim dove me'ene hakol. Malahal dove zeh chatas. What we just said before, all mitzvahs is dafke meiz chatas. Afkan dove zeh chatas. Same thing. Nu ashkan tibel go through the whole thing. Yochid. How do you know an individual? Nasi Mashiach, not how you know individual, whether he's just an individual or the king or a kohen gadol, or makra, because it says in pasuk in that parsha in Shlach when it talks about Avodah Zarah, the im nefesh achas sin bishkoga, you bring a goat. Echad yochid v'echad Mashiach kulam b'chlal nefesh achas, all included nefesh achas. And then the yil metachten mina elyon, because it says the im and if an individual. So it's a continuation of Avodah Zarah. Whatever we establish of Avodah Zarah has to be a chatas and a korah, same thing individual. So all of this makes sense. You started off saying that the very side of all of this is the word aleha. that we make a Gzer Shava Aleha, which is written by the Bezin Fagat, to Aleha by Aroyas. But that only makes sense if that's what the word Allah by Rosh is used for. However, the Tanaim that use Allah for something totally different, as we'll see right now. Like you just said. El Rabbonim, the Mafkile Allah Royas, they use Allah Royas with Soras. If one of the women that your brother was married to, you're not allowed to marry, then neither the Tsaris, the other women, even though you would marry them, can you marry in that case? And you learn the word Allah, anyone that's attached to it. So Allah is not extra at all. We can use it for Gzer Shava to teach you this thing here about, to a Sanhedrin who forgot the mitzvahs. So where do you know that? So where's the basis that even by a Sanhedrin, only those Avedas that have a chatos on the chorus, how do they know? Where they know from? Naphtali learned from tons of Yeshua ben Levi Lebrei. Yeshua ben Levi taught his son. He taught his son. It says there at the conclusion of that whole parsha there about Avodah Zarah Shlach. It says the Torah Achas Yilachem should be one set of laws. And then the next part says V'hanefesh Ashetase B'Yad Rama, and the nefesh did it, who's a Megadif, and so on and so forth. The Nichas never got him. And L'chayda, that's talking about Avodah Zarah. So Huksha says Torah Achas. What do you mean Torah Achas? That the entire Torah is compared to Avodah Zarah. Torah Achas Huksha Kol HaTorah Kula Avodah Chavim. And now it'll be the other way around. In the previous way, we learned Avodah Zarah from all mitzvahs. Now we're going to according to this way. We don't have a leah, but we learn all mitzvahs from Avodah Zarah. No Ashkan. So all we know is a Yochid and a Nasi. Ashkan Yochid Nasi Mashiach. Bein B'Avodah Zarah mitzvahs minol. So we know about all we know here is Im Nefesh Achas a Yochid, Nasi and a Mashiach. What about those two people who are different than other laws? How do you know? How do you know? The Pashas before talk about the Nasi and talk about the Kohen Gadol, and they learn from the later Pasha that is talking about Kodesh and Chatzis. The Rebbe uses Aleha for this Gzer Shava. What does he do with it? Rabbi Shimon Levi said Torah Achas. What does he do with that pasuk Torah Achas? So what does he learn from that? Mapping, like he needs something else different, something else. Tanya, we learn to follow. It says, we find when it comes to eating a dachas avodah zarah, there's a difference when a rabbim do avodah zarah or a yachid. A rabbim avodah zarah, they get a lower punishment and misa, they get sayif, but they lose all their money. Mashenkin, if an individual does avodah zarah, they get skila, but they don't forfeit before you guys get money. So the fish, Matzinu Shechila Kakosa Ben Rabim Chidim, Rabim Besayif, they get Sayif, they know the Misa of Sayif Cherev, and they lose all their money. Yechidim Beskilo, Polybo, you come to individuals, a totally different punishment arrangement. So Yachon Nachle become and say maybe the carbon should be different as well. Maybe if they did a b'shaygig, it should be a different carbon between a rabbim and a yachid. In other words, the rabbim should be bringing a carbon that is radically different than all yichidim. Every yachid brings a kesev or a seir, a sheep or a goat, or by avodah zarah a goat, and maybe a rabbim if they do avodah zarah b'shaygig should bring a totally different carbon. One Torah for shaygig, everyone brings the same carbon. You tell me, no, the reason is the Torah didn't make this distinction. The Torah would have made a distinction. I would take the thought. It wouldn't have been Torah, I would have thought that they should bring different carbonas, totally different, radically different. My nice. What do you mean radically different? What would you have thought that a tzibur who does an aveda b'shaking, they should bring a different carbon than a yachid? What? Nice par. Should they bring instead of a goat? They should bring, let's say, a par. Tzibur b'shamitzvah the maisi. What's so radically different? Every tzibur, when the Bezin for Sanhedrin forget what to do, they bring a par. Nicey par lo should they bring? Okay, no, how will be different. If a rabbim did it b'shegi, we're gonna make them in two kabbanas. A par will bring a carbon oil, and a goat for a carbon chatas. No, that's what a tzibur does by Vayichavim. If the Bezin made a mistake, tzibur Vayichavim who demaisi. That's the same thing. Navas. Maybe Nicey soil, let's bring a goat. No Nasi b'shar mitzvah the Nicey. And Nasi does that in all any aveda that he did. He brings a male goat. Nicey seira, bring a female goat. Yochinami had a kabbalah. That's what the Yochi brings. So what would you have thought? He says, and it wouldn't be the pastor achas that would have thought that he should bring a korban for Sarabim b'shegi, very different than all the kabbalas. What? So the Gemara eats it from me or thought Sibur Maisi Parlo Oil of Soil Chatas. Hi, ni nice maybe we forget. Bring. Normally, you bring a par for an oiler and the goat for a chatas. Here, do the other way around. Bring the goat for the oiler and the par for the chatas. Maybe that's what it is. That's the radical difference. That's one answer. Or inami tzarich. We would have thought, well, a rabbin would do a mistake, have to bring a different carbon, but we don't know what, so they can't bring any carbon. They have no kapara. They have no way of fixing. Kamashlan. That's why the Torah is a Torah achas, that whether you're a rabbin b'shegig or an individual, same carbon. You're telling me that these psukim here, Torah achas and all that, you're telling me, and he's talking about avodah zarah. That's what you're saying here. So I'm asking a question. My master, where do you see in this pasuk you're talking about avodah zarah? It says of the vanefesh ashtasa b'yad rama. I know which avodah we're talking about here. Omar says Rabbi, we tell you, we're talking about the whole shlach. I know my avodah zarah. Kadi Omar Kra. It says in pasuk. It says there in that parsha shlach. No, it doesn't mention what avodah zarah, but it says that if you made a mistake, you didn't do it. Kol mitzvah, as if you did one mitzvah wrong, but this mitzvah is equal to all the mitzvahs. Which mitzvah equals all the mitzvahs? I want someone to say for collect. I think it's 36 mitzvahs. That is hukshah kol Torah, and tzitzis and many other. But the part here is, if you don't believe in the Eibishter, why would you do any mitzvah? In fact, outside you're going to different holes and others. That the Noichi is not even a mitzvah, because if you don't believe in the Eibishter, why would you do any mitzvah? In fact, anyway. So Rebbe said, I'll give you another answer. You know how we know Tumah Avodah Zarah? On Makro, it says in the pasuk that if you made a mistake, you did any of these mitzvahs. Let's not learn from Kol mitzvahs. Maybe bothered Rebbe, there's so many other mitzvahs equal to Kol Torah Kula. How do you know which one it is? But rather, it's in the pasuk Dibar Hashem Moshe. Hashem spoke to Moshe. Uksiv, there's another pasuk where it says that this is what Hashem said biyad Moshe. What's the chiluk? Hashem spoke to Moshe or biyad Moshe? In fact, the end of the different Chumash, sometimes it says through Moshe, and sometimes it says Hashem spoke to Moshe. The difference is, did the Eden hear b'shas Hashem spoke to Moshe? When Hashem spoke to Moshe, they didn't hear themselves directly from Hashem, or they only heard it second hand from Moshe, that Moshe said, this is what Hashem told me. That's the difference between Biyad Moshe and Moshe. Which mitzvah is that Hashem spoke to Moshe and he didn't heard it? I would say it's avodah zarah, and said Dibar Hashem al Moshe. It's interesting. Even the first two commandments, which we'll see in a minute. Hashem was not talking to all the Yidden. He's talking still to Moshe. Just they overheard a conversation. Which is a pelvic thing, because the Pashto Pshat is they were talking to every single Yid.
But it says that's
that's what it says. That was the answer. He used it to be down chus. But yeah, okay. Exception, right? That's the rational. That's okay. Yeah. The Veda Bishmol Tana, the Veda Bishmol, interesting. Tana Bishmol is one who said rightly, yet they themselves didn't like this answer. They gave another answer. The Veda Bishmol Tana, he said, it says, from the first mitzvah that Hashem told you and onwards, the Torah says, what was the first mitzvah that Eden heard? The very first mitzvah that Eden heard was Avodah Zarah. And that's how we know that it's Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Well, we learned in Sanhedrin, Essen mitzvahs nistavi solomai. We told 10 mitzvahs, 7 mitzvahs b'nei and 3 more. Shabbos, 3 more. Paradum, whatever. They had 3 more mitzvahs. So, they see v'hayim shemayat yizkar lekecha. As I already told you, machvar to clear is because she may answer before. All Mefarshim ask, what's the Gemara's kasha? The Zayin Mitzvah B'Noach, the very first mitzvah, the Zayin Mitzvah B'Noach, was by Yisrael Hashem L'Kecha. We learned that the Merchant had that's Avodah Zarah. The very first mitzvah is Avodah Zarah. So who cares that we heard it in Mara, not necessarily, but the first mitzvah they heard is Zayin Mitzvah B'Noach, and then the additional ones. So what's pshat? So some say, who said just because Adam Rishon was told the Zayin Mitzvah Avodah Zarah first? How do you know when Hashem repeated the Mara? That's how it was. We don't know. But others say the pashas was said first. But there's a big difference between the tzivui to Adam and the tzivui to Matan Torah. There are more paskas of Kufnul Vav that shittuf is permitted. That they're allowed to have an intermediary between Hashem. That as long as they believe in Hashem, they're allowed to believe in something else as well. But and so the real so the avodah zarah that Adam was told is a very different avodah zarah. Because by us it's started of anochi Shem Elokecha, which is exclusive relationship here. There's nothing else. And now when I tell you you shouldn't have any other avodah zarah, I'm not just talking about on its own, even with me, even shittif is us. So it's a different avodah zarah altogether, and that's what we're talking about here. Mishnah. Ein chayavin al aseh v'loser shemigdash. Remember, we look at Gemara Shavuos, the three averas that you have a carbon oil of the year. In other words, you have a carbon chatas kua, fixed carbon chatas. You got to bring. This is how the Torah says that you have to bring. Then you have a concept called an oil of the year, which is that it fluctuates, depends what you can afford. For example, if you walked into the base of Mikdash when you were tamei, and or you said I don't have I don't have any testimony for you. It turned out to be you do have testimony, you withheld. So then you bring a carbon oil of the year. So how do you know that a Kohen Gadol or Bezin does not bring, they made a mistake in a psak when it comes to Tumah, Kodesh, or Mikdash, that they don't bring their carbon that we said. That the din of Horayos Bezin does not apply, only, we said more applies to carbon chatzas. It's only talking about carbon chatzas kavua, fixed, not oil of the yedid. How do we know? We'll soon see how we know that. Ein chayavim, we're not chayiv ala seiv, aloisa shel Mikdash, ala seiv, aloisa Mikdash. The ein mevi an oshim toli, nor do you bring an oshim toli ala seiv, aloisa Mikdash. An oshim toli is when you're not sure if he did an aveda, he didn't do an aveda, like you ate fast, you don't know if it's trade for kosher. But if it's a question of tumen and Mikdash, there's no such thing as oshim toli when it comes to carbon oil of the yedid. A carbon that's not a fixed chatos. Only by fixed chatos, if you don't know, then you bring your oshim toli. When it comes to nida, you're chay whether you're over and I say because that's like a fixed karma chatas. I will see and asham tali and so too. Once you bring a normal chatas, you also bring an asham tali. Ezu mitzvahs asay shebenida. What is considered a positive mitzvah by nida? Proish min hanida. A positive mitzvah by nida is that you should separate from a nida. Rashi says it's talking about when she has a fixed period, the time that she has a fixed period, you have to separate. But we actually had in Gemara Shavuos another opinion there that it says that if you were having intimate relations with your wife, and suddenly you found out that she's a nida, then you have to wait until your member loses its strength before you leave, and that's what the mitzvah that I say. But anyway, mitzvah loisa, what's the mitzvah loisa? Which is I'll tell you only you shouldn't have relations with you. Simple. How do you know Korban Baalma? How do you know that a tzibur not chayv or that only in a chatas kavua? There's no concept of Horayos Bezin when it comes to a carbon that's not fixed. And a yachid asham toli namilo. And how do you know that a yachid also does not bring an asham toli for these avedas like walking into the basement of tummy? It's a suffix. You don't bring an asham toli. How do you know? It says the word va'oshem. It says that if a person sin ma'ama orut b'asoyse a karma chatas, it says if you shouldn't have done it va'oshem, and you were guilty. You were guilty. And by Asham Toli, you find the same word. Remember, it says by Asham Toli, it says that if you did an Aveda and you don't know if you did an Aveda, but Asham, you're guilty. So therefore we say, and therefore we say, the tzibur ma v'oshem b'yachid b'chatz kavua, avashom b'tzibur b'chatz kavua. Just like when it says here by oshem by kar b'chatz, we're talking about a chatz kavua. We're not talking about tumus when you walk in the base of a normal case of chatid in aveda. So too, when it talks about the tzibur, we say also it's talking about so it says here by tzibur it says the imkol asay yisrael yishgu. So that shaloi said about ashmu. Since it says here that ashmu that you did an aveda, same word practically. And therefore, we compare the two. That what only by chatos kavua, fixed chatos is the only time that you bring a carbon asham tali. Ma v'asham b'yachid b'chatos kavua, just like an asham by yachid is a chatos kavua. Talking about a normal chatos, and if you don't know, you bring a carbon asham. Asham etzibur b'chatos kavua. So too, the community when we say this and had made a mistake is only an avera that has a fixed chatos. Uma tzibur bechatas kavua af oshel tol nam ein boel al safi chatas kavua, and so too. Oshel you don't bring oshel tol only chatas kavua. Amri said, if so, carbon oil of the yoder nami. Let me ask a question. By the carbon oil of the yoder, the very carbon that we're talking about here that fluctuates depending on what your economic status is, we reject and we don't compare it. There, the very word asham is there as well. Haksiv, it says in the pasuk there, v'haya kiyeshem. And there it talks about carbon of, but you swore, you say I don't have it. It's going to be, you made for sure. You bring a carbon asham. That's an oil related. It says ki yeshem la'achas meila. It says also the same word yeshem. So therefore, why can't you say that that if you made an asham totally should apply by a chatzah that fluctuates? So we answer there. The word is yeshem. Here we're talking about ashem. So it makes sense to compare. Yeshem is very different. Done in Asham ain't done in Asham and Yeshem. So you might understand just because one letter is different. But mine have come in, who cares? But tell you Rabbi Shmuel we learned out regarding by Mitzvah. Sometimes the word doesn't have to be the same. It says V'shava coin, the coin returns. It says the bar coin, the coin comes. Zui Shiva, Zui Bia. Same thing apply when he returns and he comes back a second time. Even though it's a different word. But we compare the two. Actually, we had traces in a few places that when do we say that? Only if you have no choice. It's not like options what the Gzera Shava should be. So we say, well, we'll learn together. But here you have a choice to learn Asham or Asham Yeshem. So L'chayli, you should learn Asham Asham. Or we're saying here is that they're not completely, it's not mutually contradictory. You can learn both. You can learn Asham from Asham and you can learn Asham Yeshem. In other words, any chatas, you should bring a carbon Asham. So it's not mutually exclusive. So maybe we should follow Rabbi Shmuel. So the question is, why don't you bring? Well, furthermore, it says that in the case of walking the base of Migdash when you're tummy, we find the same word there. The chsiv. It says over there that if you touch something or you're tummy and so on and so forth, it says that who tummy the ashem, same word. And here's mamash the same word but ashem. So learn that if you don't know if you did it's a suffix, you bring an ashem tali. The Papa says it's more than just the word Hashem. If you look there, you'll see the Hashem umitzas Hashem. It says there, it says there that you didn't. It says that mitzvah Hashem Hashem the Hashem. So you have more than just the word Hashem. You didn't do the mitzvah you should do. I mean the Hashem and mitzvah Hashem. So in both places it says there by Korban Hashem Tali and by a Bezin Sanhedrin forgetting. It says also mitzvah Hashem. Mashenken, in the case of that pasuk you just quoted me about, somebody walked in the base of Mikdash when he's tamei, it doesn't say anywhere there mitzvah Hashem. So therefore, it's more than just the word Hashem. Why don't we learn the Hashem b'nesias avayin? It says in the pasuk the Hashem v'nosa avayin. Mean v'Hashem v'nosam avayin, and it says in the pasuk another case of carbon. Oilivated is that if you knew testimony and you withheld, you say, I don't know any testimony. Later on, it turned out to be it did. It says there, the Nosavaina. So let's learn. There's a carbon oilivated, a fluctuating carbon, and it says there's also the Nosavaina. This is a little bit hard to understand. Simi Barashi was Ashi's son. So you're talking about the last generation of Amoraim, and Rav Papa was a student of Rava, and Rav Ashi was born when Rava was passed away. Okay, so you can maybe. And somehow or another, Rav Papa must have been a very old man when he spoke to Rav Rashi. But Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, according to Rashi Shitta, there's a machlekes in Rashi and Taisus. Who was Rav Nachman? Who was the teacher? Was the teacher of Rava? The teacher of Rava. Who was Rav Nachman? According to Rashi, it's Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. According to Taisus, Rav Nachman by Yaakov. Now, if it's Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, how in the world is Rav Nachman by Yitzchak answering Rav Simi Barashi's question? I have no idea. So maybe this is one of the proofs that Taisus will bring. He doesn't, but it will prove that the Nachman cannot be the Nachman by Yitzchak. It must be a Nachman by Yaakov, somebody else. Anyway, so he says, "Donin v'Hashem umitzas Hashem asher loisa sena." Not just mitzvah Hashem, Hashem loisa sena. But al yechiach. Don't bring me a proof from Shmias Koil. You heard testimony, you beat the Zayim, the 3 cases that you made a shvua, or you entered the 3 cases where you bring a fluctuating carbon. Shalai doesn't say the words. But Hashem umitzvus Hashem asher loisa sena. That whole phrase, and that's why we don't compare it. Next Mishnah, ain't chayavin. So continuing now, that only when it's a fixed chatas do we say that if you made a mistake in the ruling, then we have all these did in by Sanhedrin, Horayos Daf, and Kohen Gadol. Ain't chayavin al shmiyas koil by bit of sign by chuming. These are the 3 cases that you bring a fluctuating carbon. Shmiyas koil, that your new testimony and you say I didn't, or bit of sign you made a shvua which was turned out to be not true, and tumas migdash v'kedash. If you walk in the base of migdash when you're tummy, you're touching tummy. The hanasi and these 3 things you don't bring a. There's no din of Horayos Daf. There's no din by a Kohen Gadol, and so too a nasi, a melech, also does not have to bring his carbon of these things. Even Rabbi Sagluli, Rabbi Kiva says no. A nasi chai bekulam. Nasi is not like Kohen Gadol. It's fascinating. A Kohen Gadol who's a spiritual leader, and a king is a physical leader. The spiritual leader is like Sanhedrin. He's equal to the Tzibur. He's like a Yish Kololi. But the physical leader, Melech, is sort of much closer to an individual who has extra responsibilities. Even though we say that the king is the heart of the nation and so on, still a Kohen Gadol seems from here is higher. We'll see in the end of Horayos a hierarchy who's higher and who's lower. But from these dinim here, it seems like Kohen Gadol in certain respects, definitely when it comes to paskening, which is the spiritual side of things, Kohen Gadol should be higher. And we'll see later when it comes to covenant who comes first. Chutz mishmiyas hakoil. Rabbi Kiva says, no. Nasi is like an individual, except one case. Shmiyas hakoil, when it comes to giving testimony, there the king is exempt. You know why? He can't be a witness. The whole concept of testimony is not trying to be him. You can't testify about him, and then neither does he testify about others. My time is gluli. What's the logic of Yisrael Gluli? You said that a nasi is like a claim Godel that doesn't apply to any those three Averas that you bring a fluctuating carbon, and nasi doesn't bring a carbon. My time of Yisrael Gluli. In Omakra, it says in Pasuk, it says in Pasuk that if he committed a sin to one of these, if you're chayiv in one, you're chayiv in all three. But if even one of them, you're not. And we all agree that a king cannot be chayiv withholding testimony because he doesn't have to give testimony. So you all agree, at least in one of the cases of a fluctuating carbon, is not applicable to a king. Saying, "What? How do you know to learn that way?" The Ema maybe mischai ba'achas man, avabijah mischai b'kulim. Maybe b'chai ba'achas means even if one of them he's able to do. For example, okay, testimony he can't, but walking to the base of Mikdash tummy is applicable to a king just as well, or swearing false. So maybe those two he should bring a carbon. Time with Rabbi Naguli, we learned around from Bahacha for the following place. Time we learned Rabbi Yirmiyah says Nemar, and one passage says that the if you cannot afford, what's the whole idea of oil of the yodim? You cannot afford it. I mean, this particular person, whoever the person is, has to be in a situation that one day you could afford it. You can be it's a cycle. One day you're wealthy, one day you can lose all your money in an instant. You invested terribly, the market time crashed, and suddenly you're destitute. So it has to be applicable to you. This very person can be that he can be. The Nema, it says in the Pasuk, the Imloi Sasig Yodoi. So, a person who's capable of becoming poor and then becoming rich, okay, has this din of oil yoted. Or the Yotza Nasi, a king, and a Mashiach, a Kohen Gadol, shame more than he is, can never be poor. Yeah, the see, not see a king. The see, it says the pasuk clearly by king. It says also achas mikom mitzvahs Hashem elakav. He did one of the mitzvahs of Hashem. That means the only superior to the king is the Eibishter. Misha ein al gabav el Hashem elakav. There's nobody superior to a king, only the Eibishter. That's a king. So Mashiach and Mashiach. In other words, he's always rich. If nobody's superior to him, that means if he's poor, all the rich people walk around with their nose up in the air. What do you mean? We're greater than you are. Obviously, nobody has any advantage over the king. I mean, he's the richest guy. So how is the Shaykh What about a Kohen Gadol? A Kohen Gadol is a very frum, spiritual person, an academic, a Talmud Chacham. How do you become rich? It says, and we had this in Gemara, the HaKohen HaGadol Me'echav, that HaKohen who is greater than his brothers, Shehu Gadol Me'echav, you have to make him greater than his brothers. Benoi has to be handsome. Bekoyach has to be physically stronger. Ubechachma has to be wiser, and we said before, can be mufla. Ube'oisher has to be wealthy. In other words, it sounds from here, the Chatzila, when you nominate a Kohen Gadol, should be a wealthy person as well. So therefore, again, it's not shaykh. That's part of the criteria of being a Kohen Gadol. Others say you don't have to be wealthy. He doesn't be wealthy. That's not a criteria. But once he's a Kohen Gadol, you have to take care of him and support him and make sure that he's wealthy, so that he's not beholden to anybody individually, and you shouldn't feel inferior at all. So it's incumbent upon everyone to make sure that he's richer. So the whole concept of Eliyah is not applicable to these. So that's the story basically.